The first thing I have to say is thank goodness the committee did it the right way. I know a ton of people are going to be upset down in the comment section below, especially people who think the SEC is the only conference in college football. But objectively speaking, the College Football Playoff Committee finally did the right thing and put the 12 teams that were deserving of being in the field. Say what you want about strength of schedule or about head-to-head or about hypothetical situations you come up with in your head. The 12 most deserving teams to make the field in the 2024 college football season made the field, and they will face off here in a couple of weeks in the first ever 12-team college football playoff. I could not be more happy with how this all transpired, as for once there's finally some parity in the sport of college football, and it's not just the same 5 or 6 teams winning each and every year. Sure, yeah, maybe some of those teams will still win national championships, but there's finally an opportunity for some madness. College basketball is beloved by everybody in the postseason because of how well structured March Madness is and all the crazy upsets and the opportunities for so many teams to compete for a championship. College football was the one sport that had a terrible postseason, and I don't understand why people were so anti-expansion, but we finally got it, and I'm super pumped. Today, I'm going to give you my instant reaction to the 2024 college football playoff field, talk about the matchups, talk about my thoughts on each and every team, and talk about the teams that also got left out of the field. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you're going to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the 2024 college football playoff. Okay, I first want to start out the video by saying I'm so unbelievably upset that Alabama missed the college football playoff. I mean, they totally should have been in over SMU. When you take a look at their non-conference schedule, some say it was the best non-conference resume ever recorded, as they beat Western Kentucky, South Florida, a Wisconsin team that didn't make a bowl, and then they went ahead and beat Mercer. I mean, these were such difficult wins that no wonder they limped into SEC play. Should have assured them a spot in the 12-team bracket. I mean, for example, if they just would have scored 4 more touchdowns, they would have beaten a 6-6 Oklahoma team that didn't even have a functioning quarterback and had about 15 injuries. Also, if they would have scored 1 more touchdown, they would have beat Vanderbilt. I mean, by Bama fans' logic, those 2 technically should be wins, right? So let's go ahead and say that they really went 11-1. Also, why on earth would we put them in against SMU? I mean, SMU doesn't play in the mighty SEC, and they lost to BYU and Clemson. Those 2 teams are absolutely terrible. I mean, as Alabama fans, we not only lost more games than you, but our losses were more quality. It doesn't matter that Vanderbilt and Oklahoma both went 6-6, but those 2 are SEC teams, so they automatically would have gone 12-0 in the ACC. Okay, all jokes aside, I'm very happy that Alabama got left out of the field. I'm not a Crimson Tide hater, and I actually like a lot of their players, and their team was a lot of fun to watch this year, but they did not deserve to be in. I can forgive the Vanderbilt and Tennessee losses because they were both close, but that Oklahoma loss honestly should have disqualified them. This was Oklahoma's worst team in what felt like 20 years, and to get skull crushed that late in the season and have your Heisman contending senior quarterback play that poorly, there was no reason why they should have been put in the field, especially when SMU's only 2 losses came by a combined 6 points, and SMU won an extra game and played an extra game. There was never any logical reason why Bama should have gotten in, but many people come up with fun theories in their head where if they would have played on a neutral site and all their players would have been healthy and in a perfect hypothetical world, they'd be favored by Vegas face-to-face, so let's go ahead and put the Crimson Tide in instead. The other teams that ended up missing out were Miami, who ended up falling apart late in the season with losses to both Georgia Tech and Syracuse, and I'd still argue they were more deserving of getting in over Bama, but Miami also got lucky for most of the year, and were honestly doomed to lose a couple of those games at the end. So we've talked about Bama and Miami, and then some people will claim that Ole Miss and South Carolina should have gotten in. Just like Bama, Ole Miss played an absolutely putrid non-conference schedule, and then they had 2 terrible losses to both Florida and Kentucky. Yes, the Gators got better by the end of the season, but that Kentucky loss at home was unforgivable, and then no one's really going to fault them for losing on the road to LSU. Sure, they beat number 3 Georgia, but that was pretty much the beef of their resume. No offense, Ole Miss, but you didn't deserve to get in. Beat Kentucky and beat Florida, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. South Carolina, on the other hand, was kind of put in an interesting spot, as they lost both head-to-head games to Alabama and Ole Miss, so it would have been hard to justify putting the Gamecocks in over them. But to be fair, according to the quote-unquote eye test, South Carolina had won 6 straight games, and were definitely one of the hottest teams in college football, and you also had an unhealthy Lenore Sellers. Sure, all 4 of those teams have some sort of claim to making the college football playoff, and they'll come up with their reasons why they ultimately didn't get in, and then try to make up reasons why the teams in front of them should not have gotten in, but at the end of the day, go ahead and win your games, and you won't have to worry about not getting in. Take notes for next year. Ole Miss, don't lose at home to Kentucky. South Carolina, learn how to finish close games. Miami, hire a competent defensive coordinator. And Bama, don't lose it to 6-6 teams on the road and get skull crushed by a team that barely made a bowl game. Okay, so now on to the actual bracket. The first seed was the Oregon Ducks, who had a tremendous first year in the Big Ten, going 13-0, and they ended up beating 3 teams in the college football playoff field. They beat Boise State, they beat Penn State, and they beat Ohio State. Oregon is the best team in college football and deserved that number 1 spot. The second bye went to the Georgia Bulldogs, who had to pull rabbits out of their hat to get this bye, but that's right now why I think Georgia's the best program in college football. They find ways to win, and when it matters, they execute. The Bulldogs did have 2 losses on the year, but ultimately they executed, beat Texas, and clinched their spot in a bye. Good for them. The third team was the Boise State Broncos. It's sort of shocking to see the Broncos ranked this high, as no one would have imagined the Group of 5 conference champion would have gotten a bid, but that's how it worked out this year. Clemson pulled off the surprise upset at the end of the year, and the Big 12 ate each other up. Good for the Broncos. They have the best player in college football in Ashton Jeanty, and a team coming on the blue turf will be a lot of fun to watch in December. The fourth team was the Arizona State Sun Devils, who came out of absolute nowhere. No one expected Kenny Dillingham to do anything at Arizona State, and after some early season losses, especially that Cincinnati game, they were completely written off. Sam Levitt and Cam Scatabo deserve a ton of credit, and honestly, based on this, Dillingham should be Coach of the Year. I'm not sure if I would pick ASU to beat Texas or Clemson, but they earned their spot and they earned their bye, and it'll definitely be an intriguing matchup to watch. Alright, so at number 5, we have the Texas Longhorns, and they're going to go ahead and face off against number 12, Clemson. Texas ended up having a really good year, as after making the college football playoff last season, they faced a lot of adversity and ended up getting that 5 seed. Quinn Ewers battled injury, they lost practically every running back on the roster, and after getting skull-crushed by Georgia at home, they bounced back and ended up having a good season. Yes, you could say they didn't really have that many good wins, as their best win was probably against Texas A&M, but for the most part, Texas dominated the teams in front of them, and ultimately with 2 losses, one of which being a close loss to Georgia in the SEC Championship game, Texas was deserving of that spot. They'll go ahead and play against the Clemson Tigers, who nobody thought would be at this point. Clemson had a terrible Week 1 showing against Georgia as they lost 34-3, but after that, they would dominate for pretty much most of the season. Outside of a loss against Louisville at home, Clemson was the better team in each and every game, and for the most part, won every single game handily except that road matchup against Pitt. That was until they played their arch rival South Carolina. This game went back and forth, and after a crazy Lenora Sellers run, Gamecocks gave Clemson a loss. Luckily for them, Miami would screw up against Syracuse, so they got an opportunity to play in the ACC Championship game where they beat a top 10 SMU team and clinched their spot. So at number 8, we have the Ohio State Buckeyes. They didn't really get tested much until they played Oregon, and they ended up losing that game by 1 point on the road. From there, they had 2 impressive victories against both top 5 Penn State and Indiana, and they beat Penn State pretty easily and also beat Indiana very soundly. Sadly though, Ryan Day's kryptonite is the Michigan Wolverines, as Ohio State had a poor game plan and lost at home to their arch rival for the 4th straight year. Despite going 10-2 though, Ohio State is one of the best teams in the country, and they took care of their schedule for the most part and beat 2 top 5 teams, so they went ahead and got that 8th spot. They'll play against the Tennessee Volunteers out of the SEC, as Tennessee also had an interesting season. They beat Oklahoma and NC State early on, but both of those wins didn't really look great by the end of the year, and then they ended up losing at home to Arkansas. The Volunteers did not beat a single team in the field, but they did beat Alabama, and for the most part handled their schedule pretty easily. Tennessee didn't have the best resume in the world, but at 10-2 they were good enough to get into the field. Okay, so despite losing the ACC Championship, the SMU Mustangs still managed to find their way into the college football playoff field, and they got the 11th seed and they'll take on number 6 Penn State. SMU ended up having a really good year, as after losing to BYU early on, who ended up finishing tied for first in the Big 12, they went on a rampage. For the most part, they blew up pretty much every single team they played, until they ended up losing by 3 against Clemson. They made a ferocious comeback in the second half, and if not for poor kick return coverage, they probably would have gone to overtime and potentially could have won and gotten a bye. Instead, the Mustangs ended up going 11-2, and they will be a difficult team to play, and Penn State will have to play their best football. The Nittany Lions finally got over the hump and made the playoff under coach James Franklin, but he will have to get over his woes against big-time competition if they want to win this game. Their best win in the regular season would come against number 19 Illinois, and besides that, it was somewhat disappointing for them this year. They barely beat Minnesota by 1 point, once again lost to Ohio State, and barely went on the road and beat USC. Luckily, because of a couple dominoes falling their way, they went to the Big Ten Championship and only lost by 1 touchdown to Oregon, which was pretty impressive in my opinion. But Penn State's a lot like Tennessee in the sense that they're definitely one of the best teams in college football, and at 11-2, we'll get an opportunity to prove it in the postseason. Okay, so the final matchup, which is super intriguing, is Notre Dame versus Indiana. These 2 teams are in interesting spots. Notre Dame did not play in a conference, so they were never going to be able to get a bye, and they lost at home to Northern Illinois. They had impressive victories against Texas A&M, Louisville, and Army, and while they did not beat a single team in the college football playoff field, Notre Dame for the most part dominated every team they played as well, and their running game is going to be really difficult to stop. they get to play in-state foe Indiana, who many people could not stand all season long. People don't realize that schedules are made far down the road, and for one of the worst schools in Power 4 history, the Hoosiers had to schedule an easy non-con, and they are only really given 2 quality opportunities in Big Ten play. After dominating pretty much every single game, they barely survived at home against Michigan 20-15 in November, and were 10-0 for the first time ever. They had a couple of disastrous plays against Ohio State, which could have made the game closer, but ultimately the Buckeyes were the better team in that one, and Indiana's only loss came to the Buckeyes. They beat their arch rival Purdue 66-0, and after going 11-1, Indiana deserved to get in the playoff because they had one of the best records in the country, they dominated pretty much every team they played, and there's no reason to justify putting a 2 or 3 loss team in over them. If you hate Indiana's strength of schedule so bad, why don't you go ahead and start scheduling for the 2030 season, and load up on easy teams and hope for an easy conference schedule. This is something that Indiana can control, but it will be interesting to see how they compete against Notre Dame. Okay, so what are my predictions? I'm going to say that Texas beats Clemson in the first round. I think Ohio State beats Tennessee. I think SMU will beat Penn State, and I think Notre Dame will beat Indiana. I had to pick an upset, and Penn State's a team I can never quite figure out, and until Franklin figures out how to beat a top-end team, I'm not going to pick them. Indiana and Notre Dame could be intriguing, as if the Hoosiers can somehow find a way to stop Notre Dame's rushing attack, they could have an opportunity to pull off an upset there. Tennessee's look shaky at times for me, and I think Ohio State's really annoyed about the Michigan game, so I think Ohio State cruises in that. And then Clemson, Texas, I think could be really close and could be an instant classic. From there, I would pick the Longhorns to beat Arizona State in a thriller, and then honestly, I'm going to pick another crazy upset. I think Ohio State would end up beating Oregon. I think the Ducks are due for a loss, and again, I think the Buckeyes are truly one of the most talented teams in the country. At that point, I would have SMU beating Boise State, and I would have Georgia beating Notre Dame. I'd then have Georgia beat SMU, and Ohio State beat Texas, and I would have Ohio State and Georgia in the national championship game. From there, I'm going to go ahead and pick the Georgia Bulldogs, as once again, I'm just not going to doubt Kirby Smart, and they always find magical ways to win. What's funny though is I'll probably miss every single one of those picks, and be sure to let me know down below what your thoughts are. What is the most intriguing matchup? What did the committee get right and wrong? And what do you think of my predictions? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.